Hello again. Welcome to the 11th set of lectures on business ethics. I'm going to change gears a little bit in this lecture. Our topic is going to be what you might call macroethics. Just as there is microeconomics, where you deal with particular interactions and particular problems that come up in the business world, there's also a notion of macroethics of the business world, which is the justification of the business world as a whole. It doesn't, even though you're a good businessman and you're obeying all the ethical principles and rules and considerations when you're doing your work, if the notion of business, if the notion of free enterprise, if the notion is not itself justified, then you're rather like a barbarian who's a good barbarian and goes around pillaging and stealing and fighting, but the whole barbarian culture itself maybe perhaps lacks an ethical justification. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this set of lectures. They're also a little bit different in that I'm going to review some economics. I'm assuming that you've taken economics, but I don't really know how much you've taken. So some of what I tell you will be review, and some of what I tell you may be teaching for you. Maybe I'm either reminding you or teaching you. Either way, I've got to cover a little bit of economics to make my points. So you're going to learn a little bit in this, not only about domestic markets, but about global markets, and that requires knowing a little bit about the economics of international trade. So there are various ways of justifying a market economy or justifying the free enterprise system. Okay, this is what we're talking about. And from our different ethical approaches, we can go identity-based, consequence-based, and principle-based as usual. You can give an identity-based justification of a market economy. People do that. People say that a market economy encourages people to accept personal responsibility for their lives, and this is a good character trait for people to have. And that would be a character-based, a virtue-based justification. I'm not going to cover that in this talk. I'm going to be, in this little segment, I'm going to be talking about contractarian and libertarian justifications for a market economy. In the next segment, I will cover the economic utilitarian or indirect economic utilitarian justification, which I think will be familiar to you, and egalitarian justification, a justice-based justification that may be less familiar. This egalitarian justification is actually parasitic on the economics that's involved here. And to do this, I'll have to talk a little bit about the economics here. And then the second set of segments will be on global justice, and that'll require some different economics. Okay, so what is an economic market? What are its characteristics? Well, it's basically a set of laws that govern people's behavior. It includes a definition of property rights. It includes putting limits, making people liable for the harmful use of their property, liability limits, and it usually involves the enforcement of contracts, some way that people can sue one another or whatever if they fail to keep their promises. And if you've set all that in motion, roughly, this is a very simple model. You have got a market economy. Sometimes liability is limited, as in cases of a joint stock company, and you can get limited liability. But basically, this is the structure of an economic market, and what we're looking at is justifications for this structure, as imposed by usually imposed by the state by regulation. The markets would not. People do have a natural tendency to truck and barter and trade, but a full system of economic markets will not work without somebody to enforce the rules of the game. They need a referee. First topic is the contractarian justification. To remind you, and this is from, I think, the first set of lectures, a contractarian ethic is the view that ethics is an enforced contract, social contract among ethical egoists, and it has a purpose which is to prevent the dilemmas of cooperation, such as, and this is the big one, the prisoner's dilemma. So you remember our discussion of prisoner's dilemmas and how they caused a problem for people who always followed an ethical egoist decision rule. And these prisoner's dilemmas come up, and they look like this. So I'm going to imagine a situation before the invention of markets and before the enforcement of market rules. Okay, we've got two cavemen, Frank and Bert. Frank goes out and catches a rabbit, and Bert goes out and catches a pheasant, let's say. Now, the trouble is that actually Frank prefers pheasant and Bert prefers rabbit. So if they each eat what they caught, then they'll get 1 unit of utility each. Okay. If they manage to trade and Frank gets the pheasant and Bert gets the rabbit, then they will get 2 units of utility. And best of all, of course, is to have it all. I mean, if Frank can get both the pheasant and the rabbit, then he'll have 3 units of utility. Now, what happens when these two cavemen have to face a choice between either trading or fighting or stealing the other person's, making a surprise attack and stealing the other cave person's catch? Well, let's look. This is a classic prisoner's dilemma. So here's Frank, and these are Frank's payoffs. And Frank is trying to decide between the strategies of trade and fight, but his decision is going to be based on what he thinks Bert will do. So suppose he thinks, this is Frank, thinks that Bert will trade. Okay, well, these are Frank's payoffs up here in the top right. What will Frank do if Bert trades? Well, he's actually going to think, well, if Bert's silly enough to trade, I can maybe make a surprise attack, we'll have a little fight, and I'm going to end up with both. So Frank is going to choose to fight if Bert trades. If Bert wants to fight, what's Frank going to do? Well, if he trades, he's going to end up with nothing. If he fights back, he's going to end up with what he came with. So he's going to fight under these circumstances too. So no matter what Bert does, Frank is going to fight. Okay, this is his dominant strategy. Frank will fight no matter what. Okay, let's go back to Bert. Bert has the similar faces. Well, he actually faces a symmetric choice, so you can guess the answer. But let's just go through it for the point of working through how these prisoners' dilemmas work. And this is just a valuable skill you should have. What Bert chooses to do is going to be depending on what he thinks Frank's going to do. So if he thinks Frank is going to trade, then Bert's going to fight, because that way he can make the surprise attack and he'll end up with both, and he'll have 2 units from his rabbit and 1 unit from his pheasant. So Bert's going to do this, and if he thinks Frank's going to fight, well, he's going to get 1 unit. If he fights back, he's going to leave with what he came with. If he doesn't fight back, he's going to end up with nothing, so he's going to fight if Frank fights. And he also has a dominant strategy, fight no matter what Frank does. And they both have these dominant strategies. They know this. They may be cavemen, but they've spent a lot of time working out prisoners' dilemmas. And they are going to end up in this square. And the thing about this square is it is not Pareto efficient, right? Because there is another square over here where both of these cavemen could be better off if they'd managed to trade. How are you going to make them trade? This is the dilemma of cooperation. We want to somehow enforce the trading. That's what the Contractarian ethic does. Well, that requires somebody to intervene. You're going to need some sort of regulation. And if that regulation, for example, imposes a fine of 2 utiles for stealing or fighting, then the whole thing changes. Because every time somebody fights, like if Frank fights, then he's going to be fined 2 utiles, and he's going to end up with 1. And if he, if he fights, he's going to lose 2 utiles no matter what. He's going to end up with -1 in this case. It changes the whole picture, because now, and let's see what Frank does. Well, here's Frank's payoffs up here. If Bert trades, should Frank trade or fight? Well, 2 which is better than 1. So now Frank is going to trade. And if Bert fights, well, what's Frank going to do? Well, actually, he's going to trade because 0 is better than -1. So no matter what Bert does, Frank's going to trade. And no matter what Frank does, similarly, Bert's going to trade. And we're going to end up in this square here, which is Pareto optimal. They cannot move to a better square. Okay, so that's the rationale between a contractarian justification for a market. Somebody imposes a market that enables trading. People are punished if they don't follow the rules, and they will both do better, even though they can't do what they want anymore. Okay, contractarian justification. Here's the other justification, and this should be very familiar. This is the libertarian or rights-based justification. It's the theory of justice. You've seen this before. It starts with the idea that each person has a natural right of self-ownership, and it's got a maximal liberty, and in particular, it's got the right to manage and sell your own labor. Okay, what you do with your own labor is up to you. And then in the state of nature, if you find something unowned, then you can mix your labor with it and leave as much and as good for others, then you come to own it. Private property follows from a natural right to self-ownership. People have a natural right to their initially acquired property, which is down here, right? And so the initial acquisition, that property right includes the right to contract and sell, because it's your labor and you could sell it before, so now it's mixed with something, you can sell it. Okay, so you have the right to contract with others, and people should keep their contracts. So you get the right to anything that persons get the right to anything they've either acquired by initial acquisition or by exchange. And so other than an injunction not to waste, which actually Locke has, Locke imposes no limit on capital accumulation. And capital goods, which you can accumulate under capitalism, are usually things that you use to produce other things. They're not things that you go to waste. As long as you use them. If you don't use them, actually, if you follow back on Locke, you actually lose your you would lose your entitlement here. But basically, it justifies capital accumulation. So here's a little question for you to see if you got the first of these examples. So which of the following is the best example of a contractarian ethic? Which of the following would follow from a contractarian ethic? So pause the video for a moment, and I'll be back. Okay, welcome back. So let's have a look at these. We should give extra incentive. We're looking for contractarian ethic. Give extra incentives to high aptitude people to develop their talents because this will create a larger economic pie whose benefits will trickle down to the worst off. No, it's an interesting view, and we'll actually examine it and something like it under the heading of egalitarian justice, but that's not it. A carbon tax will permit higher GDP growth than will strict regulation of CO2 emissions. Yeah, it's a point about how to regulate fossil fuel greenhouse gas production. It's not actually what we're looking for here. It's an interesting point about external costs and things, and we're going to cover stuff like this, but we're not there yet. The two countries decide to maintain their free trade agreement rather than to get into a trade war. Aha, right? The trade war is the position that's going to happen if they both follow the country's egoistical viewpoints. And one thing to bear in mind, actually, and maybe I said this before, is that countries actually do tend to act like ethical egoists. Most of us don't. Most of us actually do worry about the interests of other people. But when you're the government of a country, it becomes your duty to look after the interests of your country. And in doing that, you lose a little bit of touch with the people whose interests you might be conflicting with. But self-interest considered as national interest is something that politicians often choose to maximize. And so politicians often are ethical egoists in that sense. And this is the sort of thing that is probably an example of the contractarian ethic. Let's just look at the last one. We can predict that each party will negotiate from an initial position that maximizes the party's own interests. That's just a statement of ethical egoism. That is ethical egoism, right? This is what you can make this prediction about countries that are negotiating a trade treaty. So that's relevant in the sense that it is about ethical egoism. But the best answer is this one, because the two countries are maintaining a free trade agreement, holding to the rules of the World Trade Organization, rather than going into a trade law war, because they realize that will make things better off for them overall, because they're in prisoner's dilemma-like situations.